When I think about scriptures and what the scriptures have to say about fathers, the first one that comes to my mind is Ephesians chapter 6, because it speaks so directly to the role of fathers in our society. Children, obey your parents because you belong to the Lord, for this is the right thing to do. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. If you honor your father and mother, things will go well for you and you will have a long life on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way that you treat them. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way that you treat them. And then he says, rather, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. So he tells you what not to do, and then when he tells you what to do. And I kind of like that kind of teaching because I need both. I kind of need to be told what not to do and what to do. And then a cousin verse in Ephesians chapter 4 by the same author says, don't use foul or abusive language. Let everything that you say be good and helpful so that your words might be an encouragement to those who hear them. What a great verse for fathers, and how well that goes along with our text verse that we just read this morning. Because fathers have an enormous influence on their children, and they must not provoke them to anger, but they must raise them and nurture them in the training and instruction of the Lord. And the best way they do that is by avoiding foul or abusive language and by saying only things that will be an encouragement to those who hear them. How many of you fathers, because my first child was born, Scott, was born about the time when they started letting fathers be in the delivery room. Up until then, they had not. In fact, my nephew was born 2 or 3 years before Scott, and my brother could not go in. And then when I went in, I was in that first group of fathers that were able to go in. So just out of curiosity, how many of you fathers were not allowed in the delivery room when your child was born at some point? Raise your hand. How many of you? About my generation, just a little older. But so you remember those days, what they were like, because I remember sitting out there twice waiting for my nephews to be born in St. Thomas Hospital in Nashville. And you know, the fathers would all sit around together in the room, and they were just worthless. They were useless. They didn't do anything. They didn't even get to go back. I mean, they weren't back there when the baby was born. Some of them were worthless later on too, but they weren't even back there when the baby was born. And so there was one group of fathers that were sitting there, and the nurse came out and said, sir, you are the father of new baby twins. And he said, man, that is great. I work for Double Cola. How interesting is that? This is such a blessing. So a few minutes later, the nurse came back out and she said to one of the other fathers, sir, I don't know how to tell you this, but you are the father of brand new triplets. He said, man, that is great. I work for the 3M company. Who could possibly imagine that I would have triplets? The other father just stood up, started putting on his coat like he was going to leave. And he said, I'm getting out of here. And the nurse said, why? And he said, I work for 7-Up, and I am not hanging around 1 minute longer. I'm not going to do it. Many years ago, about 20 years ago now, my 2 sons were asking me one time, because we watched a lot of sports on television, and they were asking me one time, who was my favorite baseball player when I was a kid? And I said, well, my favorite baseball player was Mickey Mantle. And they said, why? And I said, well, because my father's favorite baseball player was Mickey Mantle. And it turns out that's often true. Younger children adopt the favorite of their father, whether it's whatever sport it may be, or musician, or whatever else. And so that next Father's Day, they surprised me with this jersey. Now, number 7 is Mickey Mantle, and it's a retired number. Nobody else in New York will ever wear it again. So it was a great Father's Day gift for me. And that's why I'm wearing it this morning here on Father's Day, because it's kind of an honor that they gave it to me, and it's Father's Day. But really what I want to do is tell you a little bit about his story, because Mickey Mantle was one of those that you did not want to do what he did as a father. He was probably the most popular athlete of the 50s and 60s of any sport. He was an American icon, literally so popular that when he died in 1995, even TV networks took days and days of coverage, the kind of things they don't do now, or they only do on cable news networks. His funeral was televised on all network television. He was that big of an icon and a hero to so many people. But unknown to all of his admiring fans, the Mick was driven to self-destructive behavior and alcoholism, severe alcoholism. So much so that he had liver failure. And he had to have a liver transplant. And there was a remarkable moment when he was in a press conference in Dallas just before they were going to do the liver transplant, and they asked him if he had any regrets, and he said, "Oh, I have all kinds of regrets." He said, "You know, I want to say to all the young people out there," and I'm just going to quote exactly what he said, "Don't be like me. I am no role model. Tell the kids, don't follow me or don't look up to me. I always felt I wanted to be there for my kids, but I wasn't." It was apparent he was agonizing over his own lifestyle. So he decided in the last few months of his life to do something about it, and that very day he announced the formation of something called Mickey's Team to support organ and tissue donation. And over the next 3 months, more organs and vital tissues were donated to Mickey's Team than ever before, anywhere in the world, or ever since that time period in 1995. He took his terribly bad behavior and turned it into saving lives in the last chapters of his book of life. But he never lost sight of the fact that as a father and a husband, he was terrible. His place in history as a baseball player was forever secure, but his legacy as a father and a husband was forever lost. You see, leaving a spiritual legacy begins with the personal character of every dad. Who we are determines what we leave behind. And there's no escaping that. By and large, godly children come from godly parents. Certainly there are exceptions, and we all could name them. But for the most part, godly children come out of godly homes where godly parents have produced godly character, because like produces like. It does in the natural world, among the species, and it does in the spiritual world. Like produces like. And we cannot leave behind what we do not live. It simply doesn't work that way. We can't leave for our children what we do not live. We cannot pass on to our children what we ourselves do not possess. It's not possible. And like Mickey Mantle We can hit a lot of home runs in life. We can hit a lot of home runs at work. We can hit a lot of home runs with our friends or out in the community, but if we don't hit a home run at home, we've missed the biggest ball game of all. Mickey Mantle said, "Tell the kids, I'm no hero. Don't be like me." Well, that leads me to an obvious question. Then how should we be? How should we be? Well, if you want to hit a home run at home, dads, you've got to learn how to be patient. The text that we read says, "Do not provoke your children to anger." Good fathers are patient. Patience has been defined as letting your motor idle when you feel like stripping the gears. And we need that. When we are impatient, we need that to not provoke our children to anger. And everybody struggles with that because all fathers are human. I struggle with that. Preachers struggle with that as well as anybody. I heard a story about a preacher in Leadership magazine who was so absorbed with writing his sermon and sermon preparation that he was difficult to live with during that time in the week. And his daughter said, "Dad, can we buy the house next door?" And he said, "Why would we want to move next door?" And she said, No, we wouldn't move next door. You would move next door when you were working on a sermon. Out of the mouth of babes sometimes. Why would the Apostle Paul issue a caution to every father? Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Do not provoke your children to anger, because we men can have a natural tendency to be dominating and domineering. We can have a natural tendency to sometimes provoke to anger or exasperate our children. We can be too impatient. We can be too overbearing. And that kind of operating style might work with your competitors at work, but it doesn't always work with your 4-year-old or your 9-year-old. It won't always fly at home. So the Apostle Paul needed to speak to every father in an attempt to divert us from abusing our God-given authority over our children. And he said very plainly, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Do not exasperate your children. Don't do it. Instead, be patient with them. Be kind toward them. Children just simply do not come out all mature and complete and perfect. They don't. They're more like a little seed that needs to be nurtured and watered and patiently allowed to grow. And if you want to hit a home run at home, you simply have to learn how to be patient. Secondly, be predictable. Make sure your kids know what is expected of them. A major way that we cause resentment in our children is when we are inconsistent in our discipline. On one day we may be too strict, and the next day we may be too soft over the same issue. And our kids never know what to expect. They don't know where the boundaries are. I was with one of our families here at church one time, and we were in their home, and I won't say when because it was a long time ago, but we were in their home, and a child was being allowed to just do whatever he wanted to do. And for a while, it was cute. But you could see him starting to slowly get out of control. Any of you know what I'm talking about? And the parents were laughing and laughing, and we were laughing, and the other people were laughing, and then the child just kept going and got further and further out of control, and then did something that was completely inappropriate. And the parent grabbed him up took them out, started whipping them on the way out of the room so everybody else saw it, which only humiliates a child further. If you have to discipline, discipline in private. Amen. Discipline in private. Don't embarrass and humiliate your child in front of other people. And don't ever hit anywhere toward the face. And don't ever use your hand. The Bible says very clearly over and over and over again, if you're going to discipline your child physically, use the rod of correction. Your hand should only be associated with love. And it was just a very uncomfortable situation because in the child's mind, the child's young, the child is just doing what he's been doing all along. Trying to get attention, making everybody laugh, and it's been working. It was like a switch had been turned. 1 minute everybody's laughing, the next minute he's being hit and beaten. One time they're punished severely for something, the next time there's no punishment at all. And they never know what they're going to run into next. And that leads to frustration. And parents don't need to ever discipline out of their own anger anyway. You need to calm down from your own anger. You discipline for the child's benefit, never for your benefit. Ever. I don't know if you know this, but there was a behavioral test that a man named Pavlov performed on some dogs. It's called Pavlov's dog experiment, and it's fascinating, and I want you to pay close attention because this is what happens with kids, too. It's exactly what happens to kids. Pavlov put a dog in a cage, rang a bell, and a small door opened with food behind the door. And again, this was done, and whenever the bell would ring, the dog is just standing there, if you've ever had a dog, he's just tail's wagging, and his tongue's out, and he's licking, he's salivating, he can't wait for the door to open after the bell's rung to get his food. And after he'd gotten food about 4 or 5 times, the bell rang, and he's standing there waiting, and the door opens, and somebody behind it has a hose of water and just splashes water. Right, I hit myself a little harder than I intended to. Splashes a big spray of water right in his face, and the dog's just like this. And the dog doesn't know what to do. And now the bell rings again, and he's not sure, and so he goes on up and opens, and there's food. And then the bell rings again, and there's food. And then the bell rings again, and he's back excited again. He's right back up there, and then there's a blast of water. And this goes on for several minutes. And the dog simply does not know what to expect. And eventually he begins to shake and tremble, the uncertainty of what was coming. Food or a blast of water drove the dog to a nervous breakdown. Dads, we can do that to our kids. One day we're committed to faithful, loving discipline, but the next day we came home in a bad mood, or we're tired or too preoccupied to get involved, or they get on our nerves a little bit. And so then when you come through the front door at the end of the day, your kids may begin to run to you and be thankful that you're home and say, "Hey, Dad," or they may begin to shake and tremble because they don't know what's coming next. They don't know who just came through the door. Did Jekyll come through the door, or did Hyde come through the door? And the uncertainty of it can drive them to anger and bitterness. Dads, I would challenge you like myself, stop right now and ask yourself, am I consistent in my discipline? Do I need to be more faithful? Is there anything in this area that I need to change? Be predictable. And then I would suggest to you be practical. We've got to make every effort to be impartial in how we give time and attention to our children. We simply do. If we favor one child over another child, it is not hard for that to be noticed. And there are various ways that we do this, and sometimes they may be unconscious or subconscious. I mean, perhaps we show favoritism due to our children's interest. As men, we often have our own interest. And if our children show interest in our interest, it's much easier to connect to them, much harder to connect to the other that doesn't. Sometimes a child will have different interests and pursue activities in other areas, and we got to be careful not to favor the child who shares our passions and neglect the child who may have different passions or interests. Be very careful at that. We have to be very careful that we don't show favoritism according to our children's abilities. Unfortunately, it's often easier to get along with the child that has real skill or ability in a given area while neglecting the child who struggles in that same area. It's very commonly known in child psychology. That's a very commonly known problem. One child excels a great deal, all the attention is thrown to him all the time by just about everybody, and the next child doesn't get much. And dads, we have to be intentional about watching for that. Each child should be measured by how they perform with their own God-given talents and abilities, and they should rise or fall on their own merit, not how they compare with their sibling. That's not fair. And that can lead to resentment and bitterness, or the term that Paul used in Ephesians 6:4, exasperation. I would also suggest to be present. If you want to hit a home run at home and not be like Mantle, be present in your child's life, because Mantle very seriously said in his autobiography, I just was never home. Even in the off season, I was never home. I didn't spend any time with my children. Children feel cheated when the father's never home. And if this absence runs long enough, anger is sure to build in the hearts of children who feel neglected because dad was never there. And they become jealous of whatever it is that takes him away. Absentee dads usually have angry sons or daughters. So men, we need to spend more time at home when it's possible. You know, it's very possible that the coronavirus situation has helped in that one area of life, because parents have had to spend more time at home with their children. They haven't been out running all over the place every single night of the week, especially through the school year. They've had to sit down and do the lessons, the homework, the schoolwork with their children. And as exasperating as that can be, it's also bonding. A bonding that might not take place by choice. Sometimes we have to be taught to do things by force that we wouldn't do by choice. Amen. And that's not altogether a bad thing. Be present. And then if you want to hit a home run at home, be positive. A father's words, as Paul wrote in Ephesians 4, have the power of life and death. They can either be encouraging or they can be crushing. They can either build a child up or they can tear a child completely down, and it's rarely anything in between. Nothing means more to a child. Just watch their faces if you don't believe me. Nothing means more to a child than for a father or mother to praise them and cheer for them and tell them what a fantastic job they've done. Receiving the approvance or acceptance from their father. I saw this vividly illustrated last year on the same day of one of my grandson Taylor's Little League baseball games. Same day. One kid, every time he went to bat, his father was pacing behind the screen, yelling at him, telling him what to do. Maybe the coach telling him something else to do. He's yelling at him, telling him what to do, putting pressure. And when the kid didn't do well, would call him back to the screen before he'd go back out on the field and kind of softly yell at him again. It was obvious what he was doing. And you could just see the kid every time he walked away kind of lower his head, enjoying it less and less every single time he walked away. Late in the game, if I remember correctly, it was in the last inning of a close game, another kid came to bat, and another father who'd been sitting along there just watching, supporting, cheering for his kid, said, all right, come on, you can do it, you can do it, you can get a hit. And the kid got his bat on the ball, and he hit a ground ball, but he was out. And they lost the game. And the kid was discouraged, but his father went over to him, put his arm around him and said, man, you did a great job. You got your bat on the ball. Next time it'll fall. Next time it'll be a hit. Let me ask you a question. Which one of those two kids do you think wanted to go home that day? Whenever it's possible, whenever it is possible, be positive with your kids. Dads, we have got to recognize our strategic role. What we say to our children and how we say it, as the Apostle Paul said in these texts, must be encouraging and uplifting and affirming and supportive. Our words need to be weighted intentionally toward the positive and not the negative. The father of Christian counseling in the family areas, James Dobson, founded Focus on the Family Ministry. James Dobson said that we must encourage our children 7 times for every one negative. 7 times for every one negative, or they will grow up thinking their middle name is sit down and be quiet. When our words are constantly discouraging, we are slowly sowing seeds of resentment deep beneath the surface that will, in time, Paul's text says, reap a harvest of bitterness and anger. And so, every dad needs to consider these words in Scripture as if they were addressed to you personally. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. And instead, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God, through Christ, has forgiven you. Mickey Mantle said, tell the kids, 2 months before he was going to die, tell the kids, don't follow me. I'm not a hero. I'm not an icon. It's all been a facade. I'm going to try to do better from this day forward. And he did do better from this day forward. His work saved lives from that day forward. But don't be confused about what a hero or an icon is in our culture. A hero and an icon is a Christian father who loves their children enough to be patient and positive and proactive and to speak encouraging words and do encouraging things that help their children grow and mature in the nurture and training of the Lord.